The cabin of the plane hummed with the low buzz of conversation and the occasional rustle of seatbelts clicking into place. Flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, ensuring passengers were settled for the cross-country journey. Among them was a man seated in first class, dressed simply in a crisp white shirt and tailored navy slacks. His polished leather shoes and understated yet impeccable gold watch hinted at sophistication, but his demeanor was unassuming. He sat quietly near the window, engrossed in his tablet, his posture relaxed. To most of the other passengers, he was just another traveler, but a sharp observer might have recognized him as Elijah Cross, a tech mogul whose name often graced the covers of Forbes and Time. As one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the world, his innovations in artificial intelligence had transformed industries. Yet Elijah wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. He preferred flying commercial over private jets, enjoying the normalcy it offered. But not everyone shared his calm demeanor that day. 2 rows behind him, a woman in her mid-40s was clearly agitated. Dressed in a designer tracksuit and sporting oversized sunglasses, she radiated an air of entitlement. Her sharp voice cut through the cabin as she complained to a flight attendant about her seating arrangement. "I specifically requested not to sit near the lavatory," she snapped. "This is unacceptable." The flight attendant, maintaining a professional tone, apologized and tried to address her concerns, but the woman's frustration only seemed to grow. "I'm a frequent flyer," she said loudly, as though the rest of the cabin needed to know. "This airline is going downhill." It wasn't long before her irritation found a new target. When she returned to her seat, she noticed Elijah quietly typing on his tablet. A frown crossed her face. "Excuse me," she said sharply, leaning forward. "You're in the wrong seat." Elijah looked up, momentarily confused. "No, ma'am. This is my seat," he replied politely, showing her his ticket. The woman scoffed, her voice dripping with condescension. "First class isn't exactly cheap. Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" The subtle emphasis on "you" hung in the air, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. Elijah's brow furrowed slightly, but he remained composed. "I'm positive. Is there an issue?" Her voice grew louder, drawing even more attention. "I've been flying this airline for years, and I've never seen them let just anyone up here. I think you need to check again." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The flight attendant hurried over, sensing the brewing confrontation. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her gaze darting between the woman and Elijah. Before Elijah could respond, the woman interjected. "Yes, there is. I don't think he belongs here. Could you verify his ticket, please?" The words stung, not because they were new to Elijah, but because of how casually she wielded her assumptions. He handed his ticket to the flight attendant without a word, his calm demeanor unwavering. The flight attendant glanced at it, then gave a tight smile. "Mr. Cross is in the correct seat," she said firmly, handing it back. "Is there anything else I can assist you with?" The woman's face flushed, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "I don't care what his ticket says. Something feels off. I don't know why, but I just don't think he should be here." Elijah took a slow breath, his eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet strength that seemed to unsettle her further. "Is there something about me that makes you uncomfortable?" he asked, his voice calm but pointed. Her response came out in a huff. "I don't have to explain myself to you." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered among themselves, some openly staring. A man in the row ahead craned his neck to get a better look. "Ma'am, please take your seat," the flight attendant said firmly. "The flight is about to take off." But the woman wasn't done. "I'll be speaking to the airline about this," she said, her voice icy. "This is completely unacceptable." As she sat back, fuming, Elijah returned to his tablet, his expression unreadable. But inside, a storm was brewing. He had spent years navigating these microaggressions, brushing them off as the cost of success. Yet this felt different. Little did the woman know, Her outburst had set off a chain of events that would turn her assumptions upside down. By the time this flight landed, she would come face to face with a truth she couldn't ignore, a truth that would challenge everything she thought she knew about appearances, privilege, and the quiet power of humility. The plane's engines roared to life, vibrating through the cabin as it began to taxi down the runway. Elijah's gaze shifted to the window, the sprawling cityscape below shrinking as they soared higher into the sky. He wasn't the type to get excited about flying. He'd been on countless flights for work, press tours, and business deals. Yet today, something felt different. The woman's words continued to echo in his mind, as if lingering in the air even after they had settled into their seats. He could already tell the flight would be a long one. Despite the fact that his seat was in first class and the attendant had been professional, the discomfort of the woman's unwarranted hostility was palpable. Elijah had learned to deal with situations like this over the years, but there was always that nagging feeling. Was it because of his success, his race, or maybe it was a bit of both? He could never quite put his finger on it, but he was no stranger to being underestimated. It had happened before, countless times. People saw a black man, dressed simply, and assumed he didn't belong. They saw his youth and assumed his wealth was a fluke, or something he had inherited rather than earned. The woman hadn't even tried to mask her disdain, her dismissive attitude toward him leaving a sour taste. Elijah's eyes lingered on her for a moment as she fidgeted in her seat, pulling out her phone and tapping aggressively at the screen. Her earlier outburst had clearly been a power play, one designed to put him in his place. But what she hadn't realized was that Elijah didn't need to assert his place in the world. He had earned it, silently, steadily, and without the need for approval from people like her. In fact, that was the reason he liked to fly commercial in the first place. It was the one time when he could blend into the background, when he could escape the constant pressure of being recognized. People didn't approach him here. They didn't ask for autographs or try to make small talk. He was just another passenger. And for the next few hours, that was exactly how he wanted it. But Elijah wasn't naive. He knew that people like the woman wouldn't stop with just a few snide remarks. She'd already made it clear that she saw herself as someone above the rules, above the common courtesy that most people followed when in close quarters with strangers. He'd have to keep his guard up. Meanwhile, she sat there, tapping away on her phone, her eyes flicking up to glare at him from time to time. Elijah could feel her watching him, waiting for him to react, hoping to push him to the breaking point. He was used to it, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. As the flight reached cruising altitude, the cabin crew began to serve drinks. Elijah accepted a glass of water, his fingers brushing against the cool glass as he took a sip, savoring the brief moment of calm. He had just returned from a business meeting in San Francisco and was heading back home to New York. The meeting had gone well, but his mind was preoccupied with the next big project, the new tech startup he was launching, one that had the potential to change the way people interacted with artificial intelligence. The woman had quieted down momentarily, and Elijah allowed himself to relax for a brief moment. But that peace was shattered when she suddenly spoke, her voice breaking through the hum of the cabin like an unexpected storm. "I still don't get it," she muttered, loud enough for Elijah to hear. "How does a guy like you even afford a ticket like this? It's not like you can just buy your way into a first-class seat." Elijah's hand froze mid-motion as he set down his glass. Her words were thick with judgment, as if she was expecting some kind of justification from him. And for a second, he almost wanted to give her one. He almost wanted to tell her about the sleepless nights, the thousands of hours spent coding and creating something out of nothing, the countless sacrifices he had made to build the empire he had now. But he quickly suppressed that impulse. This woman didn't deserve an explanation, not after the way she had treated him. "Excuse me," he asked, turning to face her fully, his voice calm but firm. She didn't seem to care that she was being rude. "I mean, it's just hard to imagine someone like you, having all this. I just assumed. I don't know. You were maybe a sports player or something. Definitely not someone who could afford to sit up here with the rest of us." Elijah's pulse quickened slightly, the weight of her words pressing on his chest. He had heard variations of this line of thinking countless times before. People assuming his success was somehow an accident, or that he had made it in a way that didn't require intelligence or work. People who thought that being a billionaire was a fluke, that it was based on luck or connections instead of relentless effort and vision. The irony, of course, was that most of those people would never understand the magnitude of what it took to achieve success like his. They would never understand the world he had fought to create. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "But my seat here isn't a reflection of who I am. It's a reflection of the work I've put in. I think you might want to reconsider making assumptions about people you don't know." The woman's face tightened, but she didn't back down. Instead, she looked away, staring out the window as if trying to regain some of her composure. Elijah felt a strange mix of frustration and pity. He knew that people like her existed in every corner of society, people who saw the world in narrow, constricted ways and couldn't fathom a reality outside of their own limited experiences. The rest of the flight seemed to drag on. Elijah found himself pulled between the digital world of his work and the unsettling tension growing in the seat behind him. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of person would go out of their way to belittle someone like that. What made her so threatened by his presence? Was it his race? Was it his success? Or maybe it was simply that some people couldn't accept seeing someone rise above the expectations placed on them. His thoughts were interrupted when the woman suddenly stood, pacing back and forth in the aisle, her frustration bubbling over once again. The tension between them was palpable, and it felt like everyone on the plane was watching. No one said anything, but the quiet murmur of whispers indicated they were all too aware of the unspoken drama unfolding in first class. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he watched her move. He could feel it. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The question was, what would it be? The woman's pacing grew more erratic as the minutes ticked by. Elijah watched her from the corner of his eye, his mind spinning in multiple directions. It was clear she wasn't interested in understanding or even having a reasonable conversation. No, she wanted a confrontation, something to make her feel superior, to reaffirm that she belonged in a world of privilege and power while others, like Elijah, were somehow just lucky to occupy the same space. He had seen it before, countless times in boardrooms and social settings. People who needed to prove themselves in the most toxic ways. As the woman passed him again, she glanced at him once more, her eyes sharp, like daggers. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could get a word out, the plane hit an air pocket, sending the cabin into a brief, jerking plunge. A few startled gasps rippled through the passengers, but the plane quickly steadied itself. The woman staggered, her hand shooting out to steady herself against the armrest of Elijah's seat. Elijah's body instinctively shifted to avoid any physical contact, but his gaze locked with hers for a moment longer than either of them intended. Her breath came out in a sharp exhale, and she immediately pulled her hand back as if burned. For a brief moment, the tension between them felt different, more human, more raw. But that feeling passed just as quickly. She straightened up, brushing herself off like it was his fault the plane had hit turbulence. Her eyes flashed with renewed irritation. "Are you trying to get in my way?" she snapped, voice rising again. "You think you can just take up space here like you own the place?" Elijah let out a slow breath, holding back his response. His fingers tightened around the armrest, the muscle in his jaw twitching as he fought to stay calm. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This was about power, perception, and everything she assumed about him, about who he was and what he could be. He had dealt with people like her before. They didn't see the person, didn't see the decades of sacrifice and hard work, the sleepless nights spent building something meaningful from nothing. To them, he was just another black man, an anomaly that didn't belong in their world. But what they didn't understand was that they were looking at him through a distorted lens, a lens shaped by their biases and assumptions. "I'm not trying to get in your way," he replied, his tone controlled. "But you seem to have a problem with me simply existing in the same space. Maybe that's something you need to work on." The woman's eyes flared, her face turning an angry shade of red. "How dare you?" she began, but before she could continue, a voice from behind them cut through the escalating tension. "Excuse me, is everything okay here?" It was the flight attendant, returning to her duties after checking on another passenger. Her expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable hint of concern in her eyes as she assessed the situation. The woman immediately shifted into customer service mode, straightening her back and flashing a saccharine smile. "Oh, it's fine," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I'm just trying to get some service, and this gentleman is making it difficult." The attendant looked between the two of them, clearly unsure of what had led to this moment of conflict. She nodded slowly, then turned to Elijah with a more genuine, concerned expression. "Is there a problem, sir?" Elijah hesitated for a moment, considering his response. He could already feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Any attempt to explain the situation would likely be dismissed by the woman, who had already framed him as the cause of the disturbance. Still, there was something in the attendant's gaze, something that suggested she wasn't completely blind to the dynamics at play. "I'm fine," Elijah said, keeping his voice steady. "But if it's all right with you, I'd like to finish my flight in peace." The attendant nodded, offering a quick smile. "Of course, sir. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." The woman's expression twisted into a scowl as she watched the exchange, clearly annoyed that Elijah had been given any kind of validation. Her grip on the armrest tightened as she sat back down, her gaze never leaving him. It was clear she wasn't going to let go of the power struggle anytime soon. Elijah leaned back in his seat, forcing himself to relax despite the simmering tension, but he could feel her eyes on him, probing, challenging him with every passing second. It was as if she were daring him to engage, to push back so she could prove she was right all along. The next few hours passed in strained silence. The hum of the plane's engines and the occasional overhead announcement were the only sounds that broke the quiet. Elijah's mind wandered, though his attention remained fixed on the woman. She didn't make any more overt comments, but her presence was suffocating. Every movement she made seemed to draw attention back to her, as if she was desperate for validation, desperate to be seen as someone with power, someone who deserved to be in first class. Elijah felt a strange mixture of anger and sympathy. He wasn't angry at her directly, but at the system that allowed her to exist with such a sense of entitlement. People like her had always existed in society, wielding their privilege like a weapon, confident that the world owed them something. But it wasn't just her behavior that bothered him. It was the fact that she seemed to think that he, Elijah Cross, didn't belong in the same world as her. It was that assumption that people like him, people who came from nothing, who worked their way up, couldn't possibly fit into the spaces they had created for themselves. She had seen him as an anomaly, something to be confronted, something to be put in his place, and that made him question everything about the world he had built. By the time the plane began its descent toward the airport, the tension had only grown thicker. Elijah could feel it in his bones, this mounting sense of something unresolved, something about to break. He stared out the window, the sprawling city below growing closer with every passing moment, his thoughts swirling. Would the woman let it go once they landed? Would she realize how foolish she had been, or would this moment continue to haunt both of them? He glanced at her once more, catching her eyes as she stared out the window. For a brief second, their gazes locked, and Elijah couldn't help but wonder, what would it take for her to finally see him? Not as a stereotype, not as a threat, but as a person. As the plane touched down with a slight jolt, Elijah gathered his belongings, preparing to disembark, but the woman didn't move immediately. Instead, she sat frozen, as if caught in the weight of their unspoken confrontation. The plane came to a full stop, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Elijah stood up, grabbing his bag. As he passed her row, He caught her eye one last time. "Have a good day," he said quietly, his words measured. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. Instead, she looked away, perhaps already plotting her next move, perhaps lost in the same fog of assumptions that had caused all this chaos in the first place. As Elijah walked toward the exit, he felt an unsettling certainty deep in his chest. The confrontation wasn't over. It wasn't over by a long shot. Elijah moved quickly down the narrow aisle, his footsteps echoing in the quiet cabin. His heart pounded in his chest, not from the rush of the flight's final descent, but from the electric tension still hanging in the air. The woman's silent fury lingered, and even though he was eager to get off the plane, to escape the suffocating atmosphere, part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to erupt. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment to adjust his jacket, feeling the weight of the situation. He knew that what had just transpired was more than just a simple altercation. This woman, this stranger, had somehow seen something in him that made her feel entitled to lash out. It wasn't just the superficial tension of class or race. It was something deeper, something that told him the conflict between them wasn't about to disappear when the plane landed. The plane's door opened, and passengers began to file off in a slow, steady stream. Elijah stepped into the terminal, his mind still racing. He had to get through the crowds and out of the airport as quickly as possible. But as he walked toward baggage claim, the unmistakable sound of high heels clicking sharply against the polished floor cut through the noise. He turned his head just in time to see the woman approaching him, her posture rigid, her face an unreadable mask. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elijah's pulse quickened, the air between them thick with unresolved tension. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Her voice was low, controlled, but laced with an undercurrent of something far more dangerous. There was a venomous edge to her words that made him hesitate. Elijah stopped in his tracks, his body stiffening as he turned to face her fully. The crowd around them continued to move, oblivious to the drama unfolding between them. But in that moment, it was as if the world had slowed, the noise fading into the background. All that mattered was her anger, her belief that he had somehow wronged her. "Listen, I'm not here to argue," Elijah said, his voice steady, though the tension in his chest made it harder to stay calm. "Whatever this is about, I don't have time for it." But the woman wasn't backing down. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, you don't have time for it," she scoffed. "How cute. You think your money and status can make everything go away, huh?" Elijah blinked, the words stinging more than they should have. It wasn't just that they were insulting. It was that they were so far off the mark. People had said similar things before, but there was a particular sharpness to her tone that felt different, more personal. "I'm not the one making a scene here," he said, forcing himself to stay calm. "You've made your point. Now, if you'll excuse me." "Stop," she snapped, her voice rising. The sudden burst of anger caused a few nearby heads to turn, but she didn't care. She was too focused on him, on the way she was trying to provoke him. "Stop acting like you're so much better than me, like I don't know what you're really about. You're just a fake. Someone who hides behind that pretty little image of success. I know people like you, and I know how you really see people like me." The words hit him like a slap, and for the first time since the flight began, Elijah felt his composure slipping. She had touched a nerve, one he hadn't realized was still raw. It wasn't just the fact that she was attacking him. It was the way she had so easily assumed things about him, about his life, his motivations. She hadn't even tried to understand who he was as a person. "Maybe you should take a step back," Elijah said, his voice lowering, the warning clear in his tone. "You don't know anything about me, and you sure as hell don't know what I've had to do to get where I am." She leaned in, her face inches from his. The intensity of her anger was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. "I know enough. You've never had to work for what you've got. You've been handed everything. And you think you can just push people like me aside because you've got money. You think your name means something. The crowd had started to gather, their curiosity piqued by the escalating confrontation. Some people whispered to each other, others stared, unsure whether to intervene or just watch from a distance. Elijah could feel the weight of the eyes on him, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the woman standing in front of him. He didn't know where this was coming from, why she had such a deep need to tear him down. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became. She wasn't just angry at him. She was angry at the world, at a system that had made her feel invisible, powerless. And in her eyes, Elijah had somehow become the embodiment of everything she despised. "You want to know what I think?" Elijah finally said, his voice low and cutting through the tension like a blade. "I think you're scared. Scared of what I represent. Scared that you don't have the power you think you do." For a second, the woman's expression faltered. But just as quickly as the crack appeared, it was gone, replaced by an almost manic determination. "You think I'm scared of you?" She laughed bitterly. "No, I'm not scared of you. I'm just not going to let you walk away from this. You think you can just ignore me and go back to your perfect little life. Well, I'm not done with you." Her eyes flashed with something cold and unsettling. The kind of look someone gets when they're backed into a corner, when they've lost control of everything and are willing to destroy anything in their path just to regain it. Elijah's instincts kicked in, his body tensing, his mind racing. This was more than just a fight between two people. It was a collision of worlds, of power dynamics, of unspoken history. And it wasn't over. The woman's next move was unexpected, too fast for Elijah to react. She lunged, her hands grabbing for his jacket, as if she intended to rip it off, to humiliate him in front of the crowd. He recoiled instinctively, stepping back, but the crowd had begun to notice. Some people gasped, others shouted for the attendant, but Elijah's heart raced faster, and a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be simple. And as she pulled at his jacket, her voice rising again with a shrill edge, Elijah felt a pulse of unease. This wasn't just a woman angry at the world anymore. She had crossed a line, and he wasn't sure how far she was willing to go to make sure he paid for it. The woman's grip on Elijah's jacket tightened, her fingers digging into the fabric, pulling him toward her with a force that surprised him. He felt a flash of anger surge through him, but before he could fully react, a loud voice cut through the tense standoff. "Hey, get your hands off him." Elijah turned his head, his heart skipping a beat. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, had pushed his way through the crowd. His expression was fierce, his eyes locked onto the woman who had been harassing Elijah. The crowd, still buzzing with tension, began to part slightly as the newcomer stepped forward with an air of authority. The woman froze for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the new threat. Elijah, still reeling from the shock of the situation, watched as the man took a few more steps, closing the distance between them. He was dressed in an expensive suit, but his demeanor suggested he was more than just a high-end businessman. He radiated an aura of power, the kind that came from experience and influence, not just wealth. "Do you have a problem?" the man asked, his voice low but commanding. It was clear he wasn't looking for a fight, but there was no mistaking the firmness in his tone. He wasn't going to tolerate any more nonsense. For a split second, the woman's face flickered with recognition, but she quickly masked it with a scowl. "I'm handling my business here," she shot back, her voice tight with the remnants of her fury. The man's eyes flicked over to Elijah, and for the first time, the woman seemed to realize that the dynamic of the situation had shifted. Elijah's heart was still racing, but now, a strange sense of unease settled over him. He wasn't sure if the man was on his side or not. After all, this could be just another part of the web of high society games that people like this played. But then the man glanced back at the woman, and his eyes narrowed. "I think you've misunderstood the situation," he said, his voice suddenly colder. "You're not going to get away with this. Not today." The woman bristled, her posture going rigid, as if she were about to retaliate. But before she could speak, the man turned his attention back to Elijah, offering a quick, almost imperceptible nod. "You good?" he asked, his voice softer now, the sharpness from earlier gone. Elijah hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Was this some sort of setup? A test? Or was the man genuinely offering help? He took a step back, forcing himself to compose his thoughts, to focus on the situation at hand. "I'm fine," he said cautiously, trying to keep his voice neutral. But a part of him wondered, what did this man want in return? Why had he stepped in now, when things had been escalating for so long? Was there more to this confrontation than he realized? The woman, clearly seething, turned toward the man. "Who the hell are you?" Her voice was trembling with anger, but there was something else in her tone now. Fear, perhaps, or a realization that she had just lost control of the situation. The man's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, but it was far from friendly. Someone who doesn't appreciate seeing a woman try to tear down a man for no reason, especially a man like him. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Elijah could feel his chest tighten as the implications of the man's statement sunk in. A man like him. What did that mean? Was this some sort of veiled reference to his wealth, his background, or something deeper, something more complex? The woman's eyes widened as she seemed to piece things together. The shift in her demeanor was palpable. The cocky arrogance that had fueled her earlier bravado wavered, replaced by a flicker of recognition and fear. Before Elijah could make sense of what was happening, the man turned his back on the woman completely, addressing Elijah now with a calm, almost dismissive tone. "You should watch yourself around people like her. They won't hesitate to make you their target." Elijah's stomach churned as he processed the man's words. What did that mean? People like her. People like him. Was this a warning? A threat? Or was it simply a reflection of the hidden dynamics at play in a world he had only recently begun to understand? The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. His entire experience on the plane, the tension with the woman, felt like it was only a small part of something much bigger. "I'll keep that in mind," Elijah replied slowly, not quite sure how to react, but feeling an unsettling weight in the air as the man's words sank in. The woman, clearly on the verge of a breakdown, opened her mouth to speak again, but the man silenced her with a sharp glance. "Enough," he said simply, his voice now like ice. "You've made your point. It's over." For a moment, the woman just stood there, her hands shaking at her sides, the furious energy that had defined her moments before now dissipating into something far more fragile. But before she could retreat completely, she locked eyes with Elijah once more. Her expression was one of contempt, but underneath it, there was a flicker of something more, something calculating. "I'm not done with you," she said quietly, her voice dripping with venom. "You'll see." With that, she turned on her heel and strode off, disappearing into the growing crowd of people exiting the terminal. Elijah stood there, his mind racing. The tension in the air hadn't gone away. It had only shifted. The encounter with the woman was far from over, and the appearance of the man only complicated things further. As the crowd began to disperse, Elijah looked up at the man who had intervened. His mind was spinning, questions running wild. Who was he? What did he know about the woman? And why had he stepped in now, when the situation seemed like it was already resolved? The man didn't offer any immediate answers. Instead, he gave Elijah a quick, knowing glance, and then started to walk away. "Wait," Elijah called out, his curiosity finally outweighing his caution. "Who are you?" The man turned just long enough to flash him a cryptic smile. "Someone who knows how these things play out. Just remember, you don't always get to choose your battles." And with that, he was gone, swallowed up by the crowd, leaving Elijah standing there, more confused than ever. Was he really just a pawn in a game he didn't even understand? And more importantly, who exactly was the woman? The mystery deepened, and Elijah knew that this was far from over. He had just scratched the surface of something far more complicated than he could have ever imagined.